Joyce Raimondo. I'm the education coordinator at the Pollock Krasner House and Study Center in East Hampton. And today we have a special theme, the creative mind. So we're going to explore today, how can creativity be fostered, or can creativity actually be taught? So we have a special guest today, Norman Brosterman, the author of Inventing Kindergarten. Norman is also a collector, an artist, an architect, a sculptor, a painter. So he's definitely an example of what creativity is about. And we also have our director, Helen Harrison, and she's also an example of creativity. She's a New York Times art critic, or was.
Yep.
Still it was. She's also an author. She writes books, fiction books, mystery books set around art historical themes. And of course, she's also the director of the Pollock House here. So Helen is going to get us started talking about really the influences on Pollock and Krasner. What were their education influences that led to their groundbreaking abstract expressionism? So I'm going to show you slides later, but Pollock was best known for his drip painting techniques, where he drip paint from sticks to make 100% abstract art. And Lee also was an abstract painter, but they didn't just wake up one day. It wasn't like just this natural thing that just came out of a vacuum. They studied art. They had amazing teachers. Of course, they visited museums. They met with other artists. And so Helen is going to tell us some of the key aspects of their education influences. And my goal with this is, I hope if anyone is a teacher or a parent, especially, that this will inspire you to foster creativity in children and teens and yourself. Okay?
Everybody, I hope you will come and visit the Pollock Krasner House when you can. We will be opening at the beginning of May. All tours are by appointment or by reservation online. Go to our website and look up the how to visit. But we will have a virtual visit today.
You can.
Okay. So what I'd like to do is
let me get rid of this for you.
Just give you a little introduction to how Jackson and Lee learned their the background of their pedagogy through some examples. Let me show you. Both of them studied art in high school, and Lee also went to the Cooper Union and the National Academy of Design. But Jackson went to Manual Arts High School in Los Angeles, where he studied with a man with the wonderful name Frederick John de Saint-Vrain-Schwankowski, who, as you can see from an example of his work below there, he was a very conventional artist, but he did encourage his students to experiment. And he also got them interested in theosophy. So there was a spiritual dimension to his teaching as well. Unlike Charles Lewis Hinton, who was Lee's teacher both at the Cooper Union and the National Academy, he was very, very traditional. And in fact, she ran afoul of him several times because she wanted to be more experimental. Now, this is an example of her early work. She also studied with Charles Curran, and people who know his work will recognize his influence in this very early self-portrait. She was only 21 when she painted it in the basement of her parents' home in Brooklyn. But as soon as the Museum of Modern Art opened, which was the same year, 1929, she started to get influenced by the modern paintings that she saw there. In fact, her nephew told me that she stopped going to temple and started worshiping at MoMA. And you can see that she was looking at Matisse. He became a lifelong influence. And in fact, in addition to learning the basics, just the fundamental techniques of art, one thing that can help you learning in creativity or experimenting creatively is to look at other experimental artists. And of course, Matisse's work was being shown at MoMA, and Lee, as you can see from this example of her early still life work, she was influenced very strongly by Matisse. So many artists will start out by copying or imitating the art that they admire, but then of course, the trick is to make it your own. And in 1937, she decided to go back to school and study with Hans Hofmann, who was teaching the principles of Cubism. He had known Matisse and Picasso and Miro and those artists in Paris. And when he came to New York and opened a school in the 1930s, he influenced literally generations of modern artists. So his work was based on the principles of Cubism and flattening of space and using unnatural coloration, but doing it in a way that had already been perfected in the School of Paris. And here you can see an example of one of Lee's Cubist pictures that she did during the late 1930s and early 40s. And she became a member of the American Abstract Artists. She became a very accomplished neo-Cubist. But the problem is Cubism had already been done in Paris back in the 1910s. So they weren't breaking any new ground. However, when she met Jackson, because his art was so much more emotional and subjective, it really helped to open her up. So she learned in a way from Jackson, although he was not her teacher. She was actually 3 years and 3 months older than he, and he never was a teacher. But he taught her in the sense that he provided an example of how to liberate your creative feelings by still using the principles of Cubism as a grounding, but by opening up in a much more imaginative way. So here's an example of one of her mid-1940s paintings where you can see much more expressionistic, much more exuberant. And in the 1950s, after Jackson's death, again, you can see the Matisse influence, but very much her own idiom, something that she had now developed as this very sensual, very nature-inspired abstraction with elements of figurative references, figure shapes, plant shapes, things like that, but all very strongly filtered through her own imagination. And this, of course, was the key, was to open up her imagination so that she could create images that came out subjectively from an interior source rather than looking at and imitating what she saw in front of her. Now, in Jackson's case, his most influential teacher was Thomas Hart Benton, who he studied at the Art Students League with Benton in between 1930 and 1933. And this is an example of one of Benton's murals for which Pollock actually posed this figure. If I can't get the cursor going, but anyway, the figure of the man who is pushing down on a rod on the right in the t-shirt, was posed by Jackson when Benton was painting this mural for the new school, which is now in the Metropolitan Museum. Benton's teaching insisted that you study the old masters and that you learn how to compose a painting, often using emotional models. He would make little clay models of his compositions so that he could get the forms and the masses correctly. And these principles were published in 1926 to 27. And as you can see from Pollock's drawing, Pollock was very strongly influenced by that method of working. And of course, this works not only for figurative art, but for abstract art as well, to build the composition, to make the picture work compositionally. It doesn't matter whether you're painting figures or something that's non-objective. But there was also in Benton's work a very strong rhythmical quality, which Pollock picked up on in his own paintings of that same period. But there was a kind of darker emotional undertone in Pollock's work, as you can see by this comparison. And also in the Benton painting, the figure down at the bottom playing the harmonica, that was also posed by Jackson. Jose Clemente Orozco, the Mexican muralist, was another very strong influence on Pollock. And this is learning by observing, learning by emulation, but the murals that you see here at Dartmouth College, Pollock made a pilgrimage to see them. He and his friends got in the car and they drove up to Hanover, New Hampshire, because they so much admired Orozco's monumentality of form, the strong emotional content, and these amazing compositions, some of which are extremely large. And many of them aspired to do something similar. And when Jose Clemente Orozco was in New York, so was David Alfaro Siqueiros, another Mexican muralist who very strongly influenced Jackson. You can see the two of them together there in 1936. And it was a workshop for experimental art. And you can see the photograph of Siqueiros in the center. He's using a spray gun They wanted to work quickly. They wanted to use modern materials. They wanted to break new ground and not be traditional. Well, you can imagine how that appealed to Jackson. And here's an example of work that he was doing at the same time. It's a lithograph, but he has used a spray gun to apply the color. So he was using the same kind of experimentation that Siqueiros was encouraging. And even in his later work, you see the formal organization that he learned from Benton and the experimental use of materials that he learned from Siqueiros. So all of these early influences were combined and recombined as each of them, Jackson and Lee, both came into their own and created their very singular art.
That was amazing. Now, I do have a question for you, Helen, if you don't mind.
Oh, sure.
It's a little bit of a personal question I just thought of. Since you are such a model of creativity, lifelong creativity.
Well, I also went to the Art Students League, and I did study studio art as well as art history. So.
Mm-hmm. But what would you say is one of the most important aspects for you that you were sort of enabled or allowed to follow your creativity? Do you feel, was it something in your upbringing, a teacher? Does something stand out?
Oh, I certainly was encouraged. And not that it's necessary. I mean, some people, Lee Krasner was not encouraged by her family, but she was just devoted. But I think one of the really important things from my personal point of view was to have access to the art of the past and the art of the present in the New York region. I mean, we have the museums, we have the contemporary art galleries, we have the art world at our fingertips. And to have that, not just from the history of slides, you know, being projected or reading a book, but to be able to go and see the actual art. I mean, Pollock would go to the Metropolitan Museum. He would see the El Grecos. He would see the Michelangelos. You know, they were there for him. And the same for Lee. She goes to MoMA. She can see Matisse and Picasso. So there was a kind of first person influence. And I went to the Museum of Modern Art from my infancy. So I think that was very, very important for me personally. Now, people who live, you know, in far-flung places where they don't have that access, they have to do it differently. But from my point of view, it was like a kid in a candy store.
No, thank you so much, Helen. And that's the beauty of Zoom. Now we can visit all these places that we normally wouldn't have access to. So on that note, I'm going to give you a tour of the Barnes studio where Pollock and Krasner created their groundbreaking abstract expressionist art. And we are maybe at the end, if we have time, we'll also go into the house. But today we're going to focus a little more on the, you know, our talks. If you want to come back another time, we have tours that just really focus more on the actual historic site. So let's take a little walk around the barn. And what's special about coming here is you can walk right in. It's not roped off. We're located in East Hampton Springs, Long Island. And Pollock and Krasner moved here from New York City in 1945. And what Helen was saying about the stimulation of New York City, there's also an aspect where these artists were also meeting in New York City and out here on the East End of Long Island with other artists, many of whom were exiled from Europe because of World War II and Hitler. He called them degenerates, right? Because they were not painting for the state. These artists were painting from an inside, open-ended, creative urge. It was like a spiritual quest, right? So that can be intimidating to authority. So anyway, all of these conversations in cafes, all the mixing of these great minds, poets, artists, etc. The beauty of nature out here on the East End, as well as the access to the great works of art and the teachers, all gave rise to this movement of art, abstract expressionism. So anyway, in this barn studio, you'll see, you know, typical painting racks that you could store your paintings. And Pollock painted in here on his own. And then after his death in 1956, Lee painted in here. So this is her cart and her boots. Lee, many of the objects here are from Lee because she was here until 1984. Pollock died when he was 44 years old in a car crash. He was drinking and driving. which is really tragic because he was a huge success and he had everything going for him, and alcoholism brought him down. Actually, on that note, I would like to mention, in my opinion, it's a complete myth that alcohol inspires creativity. What I've seen of alcohol, Pollock being a prime example, is it destroys families and it destroys lives, and it's a disease. So it's really hard to function as an artist when you're in the throes of alcoholism. Pollock was sober for 2 years, and that's when he made his greatest artworks, okay? Not when he was drinking. In fact, he became so depressed when he relapsed that the last year of his life, he was barely even painting. So it's actually a really sad, tragic story. Anyway, there's a strange thing in the barn here, which is this skull. It's an anonymous skull. Pollock took this from the Art Students League, where he was studying with Thomas Hart Benton. And this really shows, you know, the artist would draw anatomy and the human figure. So as Helen said, when Pollock started out, he was drawing from observation and painting from observation, drawing things that you can see. That's representational art. And then gradually, Pollock, Lee, and the other abstract expressionists, they go within to paint things you can't see, like emotion, spirituality, even sound, energy. And they do it in a very physical way, not just using a brush, but scraping, letting paint drip, ripping, you know, Pollock dripping paint, and so on, okay? And that's what makes it really unique. It's like a release, and it breaks completely with tradition. And that is one aspect of creativity, this idea of reinventing. So as Helen said, you're taking the past, but then you're reinventing it. And they were so creative that Pollock once actually asked Lee, not, is this a good painting? He very humbly asked her, Lee, is this a painting? And she told, you know, she told that story. Is this a painting? They're redefining art, even what art is, okay? So anyway, up here, Lee had her pigments, and she also did mosaics. You could see glass pieces here. And of course, the most exciting thing about coming into the barn is that you can see the floor where Pollock made his famous drip paintings, which after his death, one painting sold for $200 million. So I always tell the students, or even if you're a parent or a teacher, never say to a child, no, that's not what I meant. Like, do it this way if you're teaching art, because you never know how an idea is going to evolve. And look at in Pollock's case, it's not just about monetary value, but the value of an idea to also open up doors for future generations, okay? Future painters, performance art. It's called action painting. He's using his whole body. So these are the accidental spills and splatters. This is not a work of art. Pollock's work was not random. It was very methodical, actually. So these are the accidental drips and splatters. This is a national landmark because when you come here, you really see the work in process, right? You see it in the context of the environment. Now, sometimes, like over here, oops, Pollock even stepped in his painting. You could see his footprint. But it's really important not to stereotype what creativity is. Creativity, it might in some cases be a wild, random frenzy, but often Pollock and these other artists, they were not painting in a wild frenzy. He painted very, very carefully, very slowly. And as Helen said, he was a trained artist, so was Lee, right? So there are artists who do swing a can of paint and it's completely random. Pollock wasn't one of them. The other point I want to make about creativity, Pollock happens to be super, you could say messy, right? With the paint splattering and so on. But if you're an artist like Mondrian, and Norman's going to show us that, who's very neat, he painted with tape, every line is neat and colored in. That's equally creative. So creativity does not mean messy. They're two totally different ideas, okay? Does that make sense? Okay, so here's a very famous picture taken by Hans Namath of Pollock in action doing his famous drip painting technique. Now, how is he breaking all the rules of art? First off, he takes the painting off the easel and puts it on the floor. Why? Well, Pollock said, I want to work from all four sides, similar to the Indian sand painters of the West. So he had actually gone to MoMA and he saw Native American painters dribbling sand, right, to create their image on the floor. And that sparked an idea for Pollock. Not immediately, but it was an influence. And also, of course, it's practical. Wherever the paint lands, it stays. Gravity pulls it down. He's called an action painter. He's using his whole body, and the movement of his body is clearly evidenced in the end result of the painting. He's also using very unusual materials. He's not even using art materials. Now you have to remember, this was 40s and 50s. This had never been done before practically. Helen was saying Siqueiros was a major influence. So Pollock is using industrial materials. He's for, house paint, non-art. He's using a baster at times to squirt the paint out. He's using a paint stick, a stirrer, to drip the paint. And sometimes he would use the paintbrush in a new way, which is to drip the paint from the brush. So this can be applied to so many aspects of life. Let's say you're working in a corporation. Can you take something that you already do and do it in a new way? Okay? Can you just change it a little bit, right? That's creative thinking. Now, Pollock died in a car crash in 1956. As I said, he was drinking and driving, and he took a life with him, Edith Metzger. And after that, Lee, you can learn more about that, of course. There's a lot of information about the details, but we're not going to get into that today. So Lee came in here a year after his death. She was in Paris, by the way, when he died. She was very stressed out, I'm sure, by the marital affair he was having with Ruth Kligman. Anyway, but then she came in here, and you could see her artworks behind her. And she painted all through her bereavement period. She would come in here at night. She had insomnia. She would pin the canvases on the wall, and she painted because, at night you can't really see color. So she would paint using brown, umber. And these paintings are so beautiful the way they express her bereavement period. And then gradually, her colors become a little more lyrical, a little brighter. But you could see way up here her paint marks. You see them? Now, sometimes she would stand on a ladder, but she preferred to use her body. And she was around my height, which is like 5'4". So she really had to reach and use her whole body. And here she's shown doing her action painting. You see that? Now, both Pollock and Krasner were committed to the idea of letting the painting lead. In fact, Pollock said, the painting has a life of its own, I let it lead. And Lee said, she doesn't will the painting. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean, I don't will the painting? Well, she said, sometimes I start off and I say, I'm gonna make a yellow painting, and it comes out green. Well, how does that work? Because you're in the moment. And in that moment of surrender, when you're one with the painting, something else might happen than what your preconceived expectation was. So Pollock and Krasner did not work from sketches, right? They were really, it was an improvisational technique. You might say in some ways it's similar to jazz in the fact that it had a structure with improvisation, okay? Now, an interesting thing about this barn is that this floor is Jackson Pollock's, but I told you Lee was in here until 1984. So it turns out that this floor was covered when they were both alive. They winterized the studio. And here you can see the floor was covered with white boards. Now, before Lee died, she arranged that this would become a museum and a study center under the auspices of Stony Brook University. And here's the conservators, 1987, lifting off the whiteboards. And you can imagine their astonishment when they saw Pollock's floor preserved forever. Okay? So it's really, really fun to come here and really see for yourself the floor and also the beautiful surroundings. Now, before we continue, I want to show you a quick movie of Jackson Pollock painting. It's about 1 minute or less, so that really you could see for yourself how methodical he was. Now, this film was taken by Hans Namath, and there's different versions of it. There's one that has sound, but this one I like because this one is actually in the barn. The one where you hear his voice, that one he was painting outside. In day-to-day life, he did not paint outside. So let's just take a look at his technique here. Now, how does Pollock know what to do? Any thoughts on that? You could just unmute and chime in.
Definitely has a plan.
Well, you know what's funny? He really actually doesn't have a plan. But I'm glad you said that. He actually has no plan. That's the amazing part. The only plan is I'm going to put the painting on the floor and use these house paints. So he actually didn't even have a subject or a title. He used to title his paintings number 1, number 2, and then eventually people suggested later on, well, you should pick some theme, nice titles for your work. But he's actually really just, he's one with the painting, right?
So the plan is in the spacing. If you notice when he began, nothing overlapped. He was doing compositional work, and now he's doing spacing between and overlapping. So even though it doesn't seem like a plan, the sort of listening is working where each new mark adds to the composition and adds depth and relationship.
Yes, the key that you said there is each new mark. So when you say the word plan, usually you think of it's like pre-planned, right? But he doesn't have a pre-plan, but he's very, very focused on one mark leading to the next. And yes, he's aware of the space. He's aware of the rhythm, the pattern, and all the elements of art. The textures in Pollock's paintings are so beautiful. Sometimes he would use matte paint or glossy paint, or he would put sand into the paint or make it gooey or stained. And all these variations you can see in the original works of art, right? I'll tell you what, this is what we're going to do. We are very honored today. I'm very honored to have Norman Brosterman, who's giving a presentation. And Norman is going to talk about his book, which I discovered at the East Hampton Library one day. It's called Inventing Kindergarten. And I was so impressed by this book because this book, not only does it chronicle the original kindergarten, which was so creative and groundbreaking in its own day, it was a revolutionary way of teaching children, completely different than the way we think of kindergarten today. But Norman actually makes the case that kindergarten was a major influence on certain modern artists who are very, very well known. So it's an honor to have Norman with us. He's going to do a little screen share.
But it is about creativity. Joyce said to me one day, so can you teach creativity? And I said, I don't think so. I think that people are creative to begin with, and you can nurture creativity, and you can inspire creativity, cultivate creativity. So I'll just give you a little brief about this subject here. So this is this stained glass window on the left it's not Jesus, it's not from a church, it's actually Friedrich Froebel, the man who invented kindergarten, and it's a window from the first public kindergarten in America, which is in St. Louis. And below his picture, you'll see a cube, a cylinder, and a sphere. This became the leitmotif, kind of the emblem of kindergarten. It's basically Hegel for children, the unification of opposites, the cube being all steady and sturdy, and the sphere being all movement, and the cylinder a combination of both. I have a very large collection of material relating to the early days of the kindergarten movement. Froebel was born in 1782. He died in 1852. He's from central Germany, not far from where the Bauhaus started, actually. So Froebel was trained as a scientist, really, a naturalist, and he worked as a lab assistant, I believe, for one of the men who invented the modern science of crystallography, of crystals, in Berlin. These are wood crystal forms on the left, some of them. And he says he spent hours, endless hours in a locked room with these crystals. And he was a very religious man. His father was a minister. And he recognized, or he believed, that all things were created by God on earth, and therefore the growth of things like crystals and plants would be reflected in the growth of everything, including people and humans. And had this idea early on, this is a really brief introduction to this, excuse me, that if you could then utilize the forms of crystals as teaching aids, it might be useful to illuminate for children their position in the universe. Now, on the right, it's a little covered here, it's all right, is Johann Pestalozzi, the man who's credited with the beginnings of modern education, which I believe had to do with children will learn better if you treat them nicely instead of hitting them with sticks. So he was a Swiss pedagogue, and Froebel worked with him for a while in Switzerland. On the wall behind Pestalozzi, you can see grids. These are actually ideas for teaching children how to draw on grids. There are a number of 19th century drawing techniques for children, little children, that were based on grids. In this case, Pestalozzi had an idea that you could stand in front of a classroom and say A13, and a child would say, oh, that's a short diagonal line, or B12, and that's a long vertical line. And thereby you create drawings in this transformation from lines and geometry to actual drawing. So this is the kind of thing that interested Froebel. This is years later, Karl Blossfeld's famous photos from Germany in the 20th century. But Froebel was wondering, at that time, let me back up. At that time, children went to school when they were 7. The men, always men who ran the educational establishment, didn't think little children were worth wasting time on because they didn't know how to read. Kindergarten was, in fact, preschool, the original and probably greatest preschool. It was designed not to teach reading, but to teach children the things that could be learned without knowing how to look in books, read in books. Froebel worked as a teacher for many years, and then one day he said, at some point over a period of years, he said, I can teach those little kids things. I can teach them important lessons. They don't have to learn to read. So he had an idea, philosophy he developed, and he came up with a system of activities, which he called gifts and occupations. Kindergarten from the very beginning was about singing and dancing and rhythm and gardening. Every kindergarten had a garden and growing things. We had seeds we brought home in Brooklyn in the 1950s. And also a series of geometric occupations and so-called gifts that were gifts from the surrogate mothers, the teachers, the young women. As far as I can tell, there were never any male kindergarten teachers at the beginning. So I started to collect these books of patterns. This is a big part of what happened in my life, curiously. You can see it's an accordion book. It's made by a woman, an American woman, around 1890. It's actually dated in there. I can't see the date. This is paper cutting. So young women who were training to teach kindergarten would make these kinds of exercises, which they would then teach to children. Obviously, children could not do such sophisticated work, but I have actually children's work too from that period. Ultimately, after searching for these, I wound up with 200 of these books of patterns. I figured I had about 10,000 pages of handmade work by young women in the 19th century, a lot of which looked like, not surprisingly, 20th century art. And these are some of the other things they would do in kindergarten. They would draw with sticks and draw with rings and weave sticks. These other things are slats with little joints, little hinges. So Froebel, for not that much of the day, actually, if it was a 3-hour day, they might do it for 15 or 20 minutes. They would work with these gifts and occupations. So one of the things you might do first was make what he called forms of nature. So that's anything you could see: sailboats, chairs, ladders, plants, trees. On another day, you might do forms of knowledge, which were mathematical. So using the sticks to count or measure, the beginnings of geometry, the beginnings of arithmetic. And then on another day, you might make what he called forms of beauty, which are just designs, pure designs. Now, in this case, since he was interested in unity, and if you used a square of paper and you folded it and you made a couple of cuts and you unfolded it, you would then have these parts. We've all done this. For Froebel, though, if you were going to make designs, you would then use all the parts. So it's not about change, but about transformation. So the square remains, but it's now transformed. This is another book of one of these women's books, teachers' books. Origami, paper folding, was another one of the occupations. Same idea, you take a square and you transform it, or you take a triangle and you transform it. So you can see some of these books are astonishing. Some of them are 50 feet long with hundreds of pieces of extraordinary folding. And on the page that you're looking at here with the orange and white, no two are alike, in fact, which is unbelievable. You know, there were textbooks published that showed how to do some of this stuff. Kindergarten became like the biggest thing of all time. He died in 1852. Starting around 1870 or earlier in Germany, it started to grow. It got a big boost at the Centennial in Philadelphia in 1876. There were, as far as I can tell, at least 8 or 10 actual displays of this kind of Froebelian kindergarten at the Centennial in 1876, including one from Japan. There was a kindergarten cottage there. Well, if you're interested in this subject, go and look at my book. They have a couple of copies at the East Hampton Library because the one that they had disappeared for years, and I gave them a new one. And then for some reason, the other one showed up. But there's a lot of information, a lot of photographs. So building blocks were part of the system. GIF 3, 4, 5, and 6. And that you can see here what I was talking about. Forms of nature, that's sort of a building up in the upper right. And then over to the left, that's the Pythagorean theorem done with blocks in the back. And then right in the front here is this pinwheeling form. Froebel thought children recognize beauty in symmetry. Symmetry is easier to show in radial symmetry. And a lot of these radial patterns appear in the Froebelian world and in the textbooks. So, but Joyce, she wanted me to come here for this reason in particular, although I could talk a lot about the other part as well. I just wanted to go back. I have a couple of notes here. It's not necessary. But the youngest children then, kindergarten was from before 7 and actually started at 3 in certain cases. And in all the kindergarten exercises, the youngest children 3 and 4 got the most abstract stuff. And we're talking about a giant sea change in Europe in particular, and in the US. People who grew up and went to school in Germany and France and Holland in 1850 did not do this. 1860, maybe, but 1870, almost everybody did, depending on the country. And usually not in Catholic schools, as it turned out, or religious schools. But one of the most important proponents of kindergarten in his life and work was Frank Lloyd Wright. This is the Roby House. I was actually there last year. I had been there before. If you've never seen it, it's a giant, brooding, extraordinary piece of work that doesn't look anything like the neighborhood in which it stands near the University of Chicago. But Wright talked all the time about how, and lectured about how he was influenced by this stuff when he was a child growing up in Boston. So I show it in my book with this house. Now that appears in this book, The Kindergarten Guide, by the Kraus-Bolter couple, Germans who came to the US actually. All kindergarten was brought to the US by Germans. You can see the similarities. Now, did Frank Lloyd Wright copy this? No, of course not. But everything he ever did, you can find kindergarten in. Frank Lloyd Wright. The first gift of the kindergarten, these balls, colored balls for little children to talk about colors and rainbow and swing and play with and do things like this. You see, this is from a German book. All the books have the similar, almost the same actually graphics. They were copying from each other. So that you would have a ball and you're with an infant here singing songs, you know, it's Itsy Bitsy Spider World and that kind of thing. That's what these balls were for, to start educating an infant on their way into life. And many of you probably know these windows, which are at the Metropolitan Museum. You can see the balls here. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's design for windows for a kindergarten near Chicago. The Coonley Playhouse, it's called Coonley Kindergarten. It's a building behind or next to a very large house that's now condos, I think. It was cut up in Oak Forest, not in Oak Park. So I was lecturing in Chicago a couple of times and at a Unity Temple. And one day I was showing these, and after the lecture, a man came over and he goes, "Would you like to see the Coonley Kindergarten?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, I live in it. You can come over." Now all the glass has been replaced. The glass was all sold off by the previous owners. It's in museums all over the world, but somebody had it, he had it all replaced at great expense. Paul Klee on the left, kindergarten on the right. Paul Klee was a violinist, a mathematician, and an artist, teacher at the Bauhaus, and someone who had meetings with the kindergarten teachers while teaching weaving at the Bauhaus, of all things. And weaving, paper weaving. Children obviously didn't use such fine pieces of paper to weave, but they did the same kind of work. That's kindergarten on the left. That's in one of my books. That's Mondrian when he moved to New York in the late 30s, wound up with at Brooklyn College with Harry Holtzman. He was very excited to find colored tape when he came here. Mondrian is buried in Brooklyn. So Mondrian's an interesting case within the kindergarten story. When he was 15 in 1887, I believe, his uncle was a painter and he told his parents, "I'd like to be a painter." And they said, "You know, you might be better off getting a skill first and then working on your art career." So he spent 3 years becoming a drawing teacher for primary schools. This is on the second page of all the Mondrian biographies. But on the third page of all the Mondrian biographies, they don't say, well, how did they teach drawing to children in Holland in 1890? So he gets this certificate in 1890. This is on the left. It says drawing exercises for the primary school. It's a book dated 1890 inside. It's Dutch. And you discover when you look inside that this is how you taught drawing to children on grids. And you can see it here. This is one page out of in the 7 books that I found, were friends of mine found in a flea market in Amsterdam, you go through about 200 exercises before anything is obviously a house or anything else. It's all geometric designs like these. So, excuse me. Of all the, and by the way, Theosophy, back to Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner, Mondrian, of course, was famously involved with this, how to discover, how to portray the perfection of nature, you know, the underlying truth, the truth. This is big in the, at that time, you know, the spiritual in art around 1910, 1920. But for some reason, nobody ever noticed this about Mondrian, that he was trained to do this. He grew up in a house with a blackboard on the wall that was gridded blackboard. His father did this. And that's Mondrian on the right. And that's a woman from Massachusetts in 1870 on the left. So he grew up learning this. And then by 1920 or so, in 1918, when Van Doesburg and Mondrian were creating neoplasticism, there had already been 50 years of this stuff floating around everywhere in the child world of Europe. Anyone with children, anyone whose friends had children, etc. It wasn't the zeitgeist, it was daily life all over Europe. There's using blocks for arithmetic, counting. Here's using blocks for pattern making. You can see the pinwheels, also swastikas. It occurred to me, and I don't know if anyone ever wrote it, that'd be quite a book in or thesis in the influence of the swastika in early German pedagogy on the National Socialists. I don't know the answer to that question. And a page from William Barr, the first director of the Museum of Modern Art, a page from his book, Cubism and Abstract Art from the 30s, where if you read the text, he's sort of smiling to himself, ha, ha, ha. Isn't that interesting how Van Doesburg's 1918 painting and Mies's 1922 design for a house and Gropius's own house at the Bauhaus are so similar. But then he doesn't show, as I do on the right, ha, 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 this Dutch kindergarten book from 1903, how it's almost exactly the same. This kind of bursting out from a square. This is the kind of thing Frank Lloyd Wright did for modern architecture. And when his work was published in Germany in 1910, influenced people like the Dutch and German architects and artists. And Kandinsky went to one of the first kindergartens in Florence in 1869. I actually hired someone in Florence that if she could find this place. That didn't really work. This is the famous composition number 8, I think, at the Guggenheim. There's a wonderful journal from Brooklyn, Cabinet, if you know it, beautiful art journal. And I told the editor once that I could make this out of kindergarten material. And he said, great, make it out of kindergarten material and I will publish it. So he did, upside down, unfortunately. But then I'm not sure if Kandinsky would care. Maybe he would. And of course, things like this. This is kindergarten. And I don't know how much time I've used up, Joyce, do you?
About 15, it's about 15 minutes.
All right, well, I'll just show some pictures because I have fabulous pictures here. This is a picture everybody loves. It's a Los Angeles kindergarten. And I'm guessing around 1900 from the clothing. Anyone who knows clothing might be able to tell me more accurately. But the children, this is so Froebelian. The children are like planets in a solar system, or stars in the universe. Here are those objects. This is the second gift after the colored balls. Children would actually spin these. So if you spin a cube, what am I pointing to? If you spin a cube, it's on my computer. If you spin a cube from that axis, you can picture it. You see a cylinder in there. And if you spin a cylinder from the side, not from the end, the edge, you see a sphere. So it's a kind of a hocus pocus thing that Froebel did with children to show them how everything is connected. Nothing stands alone, and you can find something in something else. The second gift, and it became, like I said, really the emblem of kindergarten. And here it is again. That's the Dutch book I showed with Van Doesburg, etc. This is Froebel's tomb in Germany. This is a trade card for Milton Bradley. Milton Bradley became really rich selling kindergarten material from Springfield. Women from Boston asked him to make kindergarten material. Drawing exercises, gridded slates. I looked for a gridded slate for 10 years in flea markets until I finally found one. And Bradley's book, The Paradise of Childhood. So a kindergartner is a teacher, a gardener of children. Everyone in Germany knows that. I don't speak German. So when I hear people say, oh, I've got a kindergartner, I'm always, you know, it's unbearable, but not that bad. So this is kindergarten. Forms of nature, forms of beauty. Look at these books. They're all 19th century books, almost all. Weaving. They would sell a kind of a long, flat piece of steel with a clip on the end to weave. So it's much simpler than it looks. It's really more about counting, because the needle is longer than the size of the paper. You could go up and down quite easily with this flat thing. It's got a clip on the end like a hair clip. And there's that bath again. And here's Frank Lloyd Wright's Larkin Soap Company Administration Building in Buffalo, 1906, demolished in the 50s, and as far as I know, is still an empty lot. Although someone told me there is a plan for using this area now. Now, obviously, Frank Lloyd Wright didn't refer to his kindergarten training when he designed this. I think the point is just that it meant so much to him that it was in him. He had learned to create with this system. And that's the Coonley Kindergarten, pinwheeling. Those colored big windows were in the bottom there. That's the front. That was fun to see. But there are colored windows going all around the building at the clear story. It's quite brilliant. The 19th out of 20. What's that?
I'm going to wrap up in about a minute so people.
All right, this is the end here. So just at the end of the system is you would take peas and soak them in water, and they become like Play-Doh, and you could connect them with toothpicks, and that's shown there. And then the bottom one is needles with corks, the same kind of thing. Well, Buckminster Fuller learned how to do this in kindergarten in Boston around 1900 something. And he says in one of his autobiographical writings that he had very bad eyesight. So when the kids were supposed to make structures, he could feel that the squares were falling over, but the triangles were stable. And he was making a triangular structure. And he said, and the teachers looked at it and they were amazed. And he said, I was amazed that they were amazed. So the thing he's most famous for, he learned in kindergarten. And that's all for now, if that's okay.
Norman,
is that okay? Is that okay?
That was amazing. And we're going to take some questions now. So can
right.
you stop the screen share? And then I'm going to look in the chat to see if we already have some questions in there. Okay?
Okay.
So let's see.
Should I click on chat?
No, I can read it for you.
Okay.
Let's see what we have here. Someone said about the location of the Frank Lloyd Wright, Oak Park, she said Oak Park, Illinois.
Well, most of his early work is in Oak Park. Yeah, that's where after Boston, he grew up in Oak Park. So Unity Temple, that house though, the Roby House is actually it's in Chicago. It's not in Oak Park. Yeah, the Coonley House is Oak Forest, that whole area. But the Roby House is in Chicago.
Okay, now we have a question from Jackie Lennon. I don't exactly understand it. Jackie, can you just unmute and ask your question? Because I don't understand what the question is. Okay, it's not quite a question. It's just a statement. I'm a
Froebel fiend also. And one of the things about Mondrian is he had gone to South Africa and had been greatly influenced by the Ndebele, who do a very culturally repetitive geometric art in their housing and clothing. I was wondering what Norman thought of that influence. That's all. And because it is very, very symmetrical and geometric and very much related to Mondrian's art. Thank you.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know anything about that. That's my answer.
Okay.
Oh, well, go look and you'll see. You'll see.
There have been a tremendous number of theories about the derivation of Mondrian's work, including that he was living in Paris and he watched a building being demolished across the road, and they took the outside wall off and you could see the rooms within. But I would love to see that. What is that called again? What are they?
The Ndebele.
How do you spell that? Ndebele?
Ndebele, I believe, or ELE. Just look up Esther Malongo. That's one of their most famous artists, Esther Malongo, Malango.
And they worked at right angles?
Yes. And yeah, they did.
I see. Well, all right, thank you.
And it's something that women just did, but there is, and it was said at one time he had gone to South Africa, seen the work, and brought back ideas with that. So. Okay,
thank you.
You're welcome.
John over here says some of the patterns remind me of Pueblo Indian artwork.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
yes.
I think I think that there's Carl Jung. He said what's the word for it? There are certain forms that appear all over the world.
Universal. They're universal.
Universal forms, and a lot of them are based on nature, like the spiral. I don't know the names of the other ones, but it's sort of like 3 basic natural forms and then you can find that in art all over the world. So maybe that's what we're hinting at here too.
I think that would really appeal to Froebel, that he's showing kids that's how nature works.
So Rhoda Kellogg did a study of children's art and how it developed spontaneously. She collected some tens of thousands of pieces of children's art, things they did in the sand on foggy mirrors and all that stuff. And what she was able to show is that there are 20 basic scribbles, and that then they become aggregates, that children intentionally place them in a standard set of placement patterns on the page. And one of the first aggregates that appears, actually, aside from the square and the cross, is the mandala. And so all of these forms are very reminiscent of what children spontaneously create without introducing them to them. It's what they figure out. There's an artist.
He didn't invent this stuff.
He calls it the visual. He calls it visual vocabulary, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Barry said in the chat here, the word could also be called archetypal.
Yeah.
So Norman, I had a question for you when we were planning this. In your own lifetime, what would you say is some of your major influences of why you became so creative? And I know there's many, many aspects to that, but what's sort of one of them overarching?
My mother was a painter, so she used to take us to the Brooklyn Museum all the time. And I suppose that started it, my interest in art, basically, yeah.
Similar to what Helen said.
But I never learned, the worst teacher I ever had in school was my 11th grade math teacher. She hated us, and she was afraid to touch our pens and our tests. She was a germaphobe, and I never learned algebra. So I was afraid to go into something like architecture or engineering, which I did later. So I decided to go into art instead.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that sort of led you on your path, and it kind of, the negative sort of steered you in another direction.
Exactly.
Okay.
I learned the algebra later in architecture school, but my mother would take us to museums. which is what I do.
That makes the point for all your school teachers out there, if anybody's a teacher or a parent, to make the extra effort to get those kids on the school trips, even if it's on Zoom, and make the extra effort to access the museums. So let's thank Norman for an extraordinary talk. And I think it's so rich in content, and just the images were so beautiful. So thank you so much, Norman.
Well, thank you.
And we'll come back at the end to some questions as well. But I would like to take some time to talk a little bit about my own experience as a museum educator and an author, teaching what's called visual literacy. So Norman, and we were talking about with Pollock, the hands-on, right? The doing, the making. But it's really equally as important, in my opinion, to teach kids how to see in a creative, open-ended way. So this, of course, is such a broad subject, so I'm just going to touch upon it, and I hope it makes you want to learn more, okay? So I'm going to do a little screen share. And what I would like to tell you while I'm arranging this is that I think it's actually really funny. My parents never took me to a museum, and I turned out pretty creative. Now, how could that be? No one in my entire family was an artist. Nobody had a college education. So how did it turn out that I really would consider myself a very creative person, and I've had some success in the arts. And one of the reasons there's two things. One, well, there's more than two, but one is my parents were not authoritarian. And Norman, you said in your talk that the teachers used to hit the kids with sticks, and then they learned to be nice to them, okay? So you don't have to literally hit a kid with a stick. You can hit a kid with a metaphorical stick by constantly testing them and making them think that there's one right answer to everything that they have to follow. It's so stressful for children. So be nice to them is actually allowing them to play and have some creative freedom. And that's what my parents did. It was a very child-centered house where we had toys. I could paint, I could go to art lessons. I was always encouraged. And my parents never told me, no, you should make your painting that way. No, you're not going to be an artist or anything like that. It was like, just make your art and you're going to be an artist. And I'll just always be thankful to them for that. But anyway, so this is a series of books that I wrote about art. And these books teach children how to be creative by looking at the world's great art, specifically modern art. So I'm just going to give you some samples from this book, Express Yourself. And basically what I did is I took a broad topic like expressionism, but instead of presenting it in an art historical term, I make it user-friendly by saying we're going to explore in this book how artists express their feelings. So if you're a teacher, when you arrange an art subject or an art talk, even for adults, it's generally easier for people to access art if it's within a theme that's relatable. Okay, so there's many, many themes. One of them is a broad theme, is feelings in art. So here's the screen by Edward Munch. Now, the approach is I am not going to tell you about this artwork. We're turning this completely around. This is not a lecture. This is not about information, and it's not about what the artist was thinking when he made it or when it was made or anything like that. It's not about a curator's idea. This is simply about what you see in the picture. Now, it's really important when you're teaching creativity, whether it's making art or discussing art, there's no right or wrong way to do it. Okay, there's nothing you could possibly say that's stupid or wrong. In fact, one person might have one opinion and everyone on this Zoom call might disagree. It does not mean the person is wrong. In fact, as we all know, sometimes the most creative thinkers are the ones that everybody disagrees with, right? So, what I would like to do is I need to see the chat. Wait, I don't know. Okay. I'll tell you what, you could just unmute yourself when you want to say something because I can't see the chat and do the screen share at the same time. So this is, I'm not even going to discuss the title. Let's just take a look at this picture. And I want someone to unmute and tell us what is happening in this picture.
Agony.
Agony. And what makes you say that, John?
The expression on the person's face, the hands across the face, the red sky, and the walkway is depressing.
And what about the walkway is depressing?
It's walking away. It's not coming toward us, it's actually walking away. It draws your eye to the other two people at the far end.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. So who agrees with that, or who has a different word to describe what's happening in this painting, or who can add to that? John says agony. Who has something different?
If he was laughing, would this painting be as famous? Do you hear me?
Well, that's a good question, Norman. What do you mean by that?
Sure, because it's so famous, you know, it's just so famous and it's everywhere. But if you change it slightly, he'd be laughing, wouldn't he? He wouldn't be in agony. Of course, that's not what Munch had in mind, you know.
Like what's okay, but sort of that's kind of, you're talking about something that's not in the picture in a way. But let me
exactly.
ask you something. His mouth is open.
Yeah, he's screaming, or he's in an agony. He's frightened. Yeah.
But here's my question, Norman. How do we know he's not laughing, even though his mouth is open? How do we know he's in pain?
Well, that's true. Do we?
The background tells you it is.
In what way, John?
Depressing. It's violent. It's orange. The blues don't overcome the orange.
Well, I thought orange was usually, people say orange is a happy color. So what about it in this picture makes it look agonizing?
The sky used to be blue, but now it's orange. It's the reverse.
Mm-hmm. Okay, anybody agree? So we have a little debate here. Norman says it could be laughing.
No, I said if you changed it a little, it could be laughing.
If you change, and how would you have to change
Well,
it?
you'd have to, his eyes would have to be closed more, and his mouth would have to be in a smile, you know.
I know he's screaming because the name of the painting is The Scream.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, that's exactly right.
Okay, even if
Exactly.
you didn't know it was called The Scream,
The ice cream.
I'm going to ask you, how would you be able to tell he's screaming?
Well, he looks like he's screaming, doesn't he?
What, Norman? What about him looks like he's screaming?
Well, a mouth in an O like that is a screaming mouth. An eyes wide open is a screaming mouth, right?
Holding his head.
Screaming eye.
Anything else?
Holding his head. Yeah, he's holding his head.
Oh, it's terrible.
Okay,
Yeah.
now let's take a look at the picture. We say he's in agony. So far we've said he's screaming. We said the sky is a really, really bright orange. And it looks violent to John. Norman says if you made some changes, it could be a laughter. Now let's zoom back to those two people. Now, are we sure those are people, or could they be something else?
No, those are people.
Okay, and who can describe the people?
They're walking away, aren't they? Or are they?
Okay, Norman.
Very tall and skinny.
They're tall and skinny. Does everybody? Yeah.
I would say that when I saw this for the first time, I don't think I saw the name of it first. And I thought that he looked completely surprised.
Yeah,
It's like
surprised.
something just happened before his eyes.
Yes, Cheryl, right. Sometimes he could also look surprised. So
Yeah, surprised. Yeah.
now I'm going to ask you, what could it be if you look in the picture? Can you find something that's making him agonized or surprised? What actually is happening in the picture that would make him scream?
Somebody just fell overboard over the bridge.
Well, it's
That's a
possible that
waterfall in the back.
those people just told him everything's on.
What the people tell him, Cheryl?
That maybe something's on fire. Maybe he realizes that it's his house.
Those two people look like they're walking away from each other. The one on the right is blue and it looks like maybe a woman because you can see her face.
Yeah.
The other person looks like a man with a hat and it looks like the back of his head. Or maybe he's turning his
So
head.
you think they're not together?
Yeah,
So,
look, it's separated. Well, it looks like they're walking, maybe not clear if they're together, but they could be walking together and this person could be screaming because of that. I mean, who knows?
mm-hmm. We'll take one more comment on the screen by Edward Monk. Anybody else? Anybody have a completely different idea, something we didn't say?
It's the most stolen painting of all time.
That is true, Norman.
Stolen,
okay,
what, three or four
times?
Well,
if you had this painting stolen from you, you'd be screaming too.
Yeah, because it's worth so much money. That's why.
Joyce?
We're gonna fast forward for the sake of time. These are some of the other images in the book. Okay.
I'm gonna have to go soon.
Okay, go ahead. If you have to leave, Norman, I understand. So here's a Pollock that's in the book. But rather than coming in cold to a Pollock, sometimes it's helpful to put it in the context of a theme. And sometimes it can be helpful to give a Pollock quote. So Pollock said, I want to express my feelings rather than illustrate them. An illustration tells a story. So Edward Monk's picture was a narrative picture, right? There's a story, there's a character, a setting, a place. Pollock, it's really pure expression with the paint itself. So let's take a look at the picture, take a fresh look. There's no right or wrong answers. What feeling do you think this shows, or anything else it makes you think of?
Warm and wild and chaotic.
Mm-hmm. And what makes you say it's chaotic, Cheryl?
Well, just things are just moving in every different direction.
Mm-hmm. Anything else make it look chaotic?
Yeah, the way it's painted. There's some lines that are in different directions.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anybody think it's not chaotic? Does somebody have a different word to describe, or anything you see in the picture, whatever it makes you think of? Who can add to that?
It looks tangled to me.
Mm-hmm. And what makes you say that?
Well, things cross in all different directions.
Uh-huh.
You can't see a beginning or ending to any color.
Mm-hmm.
It keeps going in and out.
Anybody else?
Joyce?
Yeah.
Rita, I see hope. I see chaos and all of the orange, and where the orange is,
mm-hmm.
I see brightness. I see something interrupting the chaos that's going around. So I see a combination of the two.
Oh, so you see the color orange to you could represent more of a hopeful feeling, sort of transforming out of the darkness.
Breaking out.
Okay, anybody else? We'll take one more.
Well, that black spot or global figure on the top, sort of to the right, is very foreboding to me. Looks like a man's dark head.
Yeah, now sometimes when you look at the drips and splatters, you could start to see recognizable images in them. And we're not saying Pollock did that on purpose, but the human mind, we do tend to see faces, and we do tend to sort of stretch to see something recognizable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I want to go over with you, and I know it seems extremely simplistic, this technique I'm using, but I really want to go over with you how to ask questions about art to maximize creative thinking and why, okay? And then after, I'll show you just really enjoyable, some children's artworks that were inspired. So really important for this is the idea of what kinds of questions do you ask when you're looking at art, or for that matter, really discussing anything, if you want to have a creative conversation. Open-ended questions. An open-ended question cannot be answered with yes or no or either or. So I'll give you an example. If I say, what's going on in this picture? you could say, I have no idea what you're going to say. You could say, it reminds me of Florida for all I know. I have no idea what you're going to say. But if I said to you, looking at Munch's painting, is he happy or sad? What's wrong with that question?
It's a one-word answer.
It's a one-way answer, and I'm actually leading and telling you the answer. I'm actually controlling your answer by giving you two choices. Or I could say, is he afraid? That's not a good question. You could just answer yes or no. So this is so important. Let's say, even if you're having a discussion that's not about art, you're sitting at a dinner party. You could say, what's your favorite food? Instead of, do you like Chinese food? It's better conversation skills. This works great with teenagers, by the way. Teenagers love me because it's all about asking an open question and listening. I let go of my idea. I am 100% listening to you. Okay? So a lot of teachers, well-meaning, will ask a question, but they'll have the answer in the question. And then if the children don't say the answer, you know what they start doing? The kids go, I know what you're thinking. I know what you're thinking. And then it becomes a guess what I'm thinking teaching experience. Okay? So be brave if you're a teacher, and don't worry about, well, what if the kid says something ridiculous? What if the conversation falls flat? Well, it might, but that's how you're going to learn to be a good teacher if you try these techniques. Now, the second question is asking for reasoned evidence. So I'm soliciting and inviting opinions, but I'm then asking you for reasoned evidence backing up your opinion with something actually in the picture. So if John said, oh, he's in agony. Well, John, what makes you say that? Now we go from an opinion into really creating a persuasive argument. Well, because I see the orange. And then I could probe a little in a gentle way. Well, is there anything else in the picture that makes you say that? Right? This is really good for any discussion. This is good if you're discussing politics, our favorite subject these days, right? So, oh, well, I have an opinion. This one's a better president. Well, what makes you say that? Well, what makes you say that? Oh, does anybody have a different idea? Right? And then we can get a lively debate going in a friendly, respectful way, because we're listening to each other, and each person is actually, in a fluid way, you're expanding your creative ideas by hearing the ideas of other people. Okay? This is so important. Nowadays, you know what happens in the media? We only get streamed all the news that agrees with us, right? If you're a Democrat, you get all the papers that are Democratic. If you're a Republican, you get all the news that supports that idea. Well, what's wrong with that? Your mind becomes so narrow. So I like a challenge. I never mind if somebody, I love it when someone comes to one of my classes, and I think it's actually funny, and they go, I hate Picasso. The class is about Picasso. I'm like, that's great, sit down. I'd really like to hear someone that can push it a little. Give me a different point of view. Let's not preach to the choir, right? So we're having a little debate. We're inviting different opinions. We're listening respectfully. And also we're honoring the idea of ambiguity. What is ambiguity? It's not clear cut. When you look at Pollock, it might be chaos, or it might be transformation, or it might be lyrical, or it might remind you of Halloween. It's not clear cut. There's not one, you can't boil it down. And that's why it's a great painting. Now, what's higher level thinking skills? Higher level thinking skills is the ability to realize that things are ambiguous, right? It's critical thinking skills. You don't have to just take the first answer and run with it. You could look at it from different angles and say, well, wait a minute, she says it's chaotic. I thought it was a happy painting, right? Maybe it is a happy painting, or could it be both, etc. Okay? And well, the other aspect of this on that note is there's a social emotional component to this, right? Which is that we're all looking at the same thing. We're seeing it from different perspectives, and we're actually creating empathy and community by looking at art. Now that might sound far-fetched. Well, what do you mean we're creating empathy? It is 100% true, and I'll tell you, I know it because I have actually heard children who have learned the word empathy in their character education classes. And when I was discussing, for example, Picasso Weeping Woman, the kid says, you know what, I'm learning empathy. I feel for that woman. I felt like that too. And I know in my own life, when I've gone to the museums, when I was a young adult, and I saw some really sad paintings by Frida Kahlo or Edward Munch. And I said, I felt like that too. Right? Yeah, I understand that's part of the human experience to feel sad. Okay? Now, when you practice this technique, the key with this is it's very simple. Ask open-ended questions, ask for reasoned evidence, ask for a variety of opinions. It's very simple, but it can be very difficult for some people to do. Because if you're the type of person who wants to know the answer in advance, this could be really hard for you. So the key is to let go of your preconceived ideas. Now, what if somebody says something bizarre, which sometimes, of course, they do? Well, then you say, what makes you say that? And there might be a reason. They said there's a helicopter in the picture. Maybe there's a reason. And we're not saying that this is what Edward Munch thought. This is what you see when you look at the picture based on your experiences and your culture. At the end, if you want to bring in a little information and you can say, well, you know, Pollock, you could use the quote at the end. He said, I want to express my feelings. Or in fact, Edward Munch was standing on a bridge and he saw the sky got blood red and he went home that day. You can bring in some information at the end, typically in an anecdotal fashion would be better, right? Nothing too technical. Now, I just want to show you for enjoyment some of the children's art that's in my books, or some of it isn't, to just show you when you open up doors of creativity for children, really how beautiful it is, or anybody. Well, I mean, I'm saying children, but really it's adults too, right? So before COVID, of course, we did a lot of drip painting face to face. You could do it like this, and it doesn't have to be outdoors or in a huge setting. You can let kids have a little creative freedom, and they're not going to go berserk. They'll understand they have to get it on the painting. So these are examples of artworks I put in my book, and I'm sorry, they have those little tags because I don't usually show them digitally like this, but I just grabbed them today. And that was my original photo from years ago. But you could see drip painting by children, but showing different modes of expression, right? Using Edward Munch as an inspiration for printmaking and talking to kids about different expressions, silly, surprised, sad, angry, right? Painting your fear like Edward Munch. You're not copying Edward Munch, but you're going to think about what fear do I have that I want to draw, and then guiding children through some of the process of that. Abstract art, teaching kids how lines can have an expressive quality. This was based on Kandinsky. Inspired by Van Gogh. No, we don't have to copy Van Gogh's Starry Night. Can you make a sky that's expressive, right? That communicates an emotion? Can you use color like Van Gogh or Picasso to communicate an emotion? I'm feeling blue. Can you use line like Van Gogh to show movement in a painting? Okay, so some teachers more meaningfully, they have the kids copy the painting, and that might be fun and entertaining and educational, but in my opinion, it's not maximizing creative thinking. You can, just like Helen said in her original talk, Pollock and Krasna took, you know, the artworks they saw and made it their own. And you can also do that with children or even yourself as an artist. Learn from the past, but now we're going to make it our own. We're going to use it for inspiration. We don't have to literally copy it. Make sense? I'll tell you what, I'll take a few quick questions, ideas, comments, disagreement, anything?
Well, I learned a lot from that.
Oh, really sweet. Thank you.
I really enjoyed that.
I'm glad.
It's really something.
Where are your books available through?
You know what, they're out of print, but they're available on Amazon and Alibris on the website.
Thank you. I have a 10-year-old that needs them.
It's fun. You know, also the book Express Yourself is really good. Just the idea, it doesn't have to be through the book. I mean, I don't really make money off of them anymore. It's really just the idea of giving children that creative outlet, right? Especially pre-teen age. Any comments, ideas? Well, we have a lot of thank you to Norman, and thank you to Helen Harrison, who is not here right now, and thank you for all of you for coming. I hope that you want to learn more.
Thank you so much.
And just really opens your own creativity. That's the idea behind it, right? Because if we learn about artists and we're shut down, what's the point? Right? We want to enjoy it for ourselves. And thank you to my Zoom friends who I've never met in real life, who now I know on Zoom. So always nice to see you. And have a beautiful day. And stay safe. And come visit in real life, pkhouse.org. You can sign up for the tour. Okay, and thank you, Norman.